Welcome everyone to the IDSS Distinguished Series. I am very pleased to introduce Professor Craig Watkins as the speaker of the day. Craig comes to us from UT Austin as the professor, the Ernst Sharp Centennial Professor, and also he is the founding director of the Institute of Media Innovation. So Craig does a lot of interesting work in the space of media, in particular how it affects social behavior, and in particular on systemic racism. So we were very interested in Craig visiting IDSS and also becoming an MLK fellow, particularly because of, first of all, his great knowledge in this field and, as exemplified by the many books that he's written in this area, but particularly because we're launching this initiative in systemic racism, and we couldn't have someone who is more appropriate to actually has done a lot of research in this area to help us out in the various verticals that we're working on. I know that Craig actually has a large, or I don't know the size of the grant, but certainly a 6-year grant that is funded directly from the VPR at UT Austin to look at issues of AI equity in general, but in particular focused on health and transportation. And so at least we know the two verticals that he has a lot of expertise on, in addition to social media. So we're benefiting a lot from Craig's presence at IDSS, and I would like to say that for everyone here, to seek him out. He's around for the whole year, and he'll be very happy to engage you in different discussions. With that, I would like to welcome Craig.
I think they have me. Can you hear me? Am I mic okay? Okay, great, thanks. Thank you, Manja, for the very generous introduction. And I want to say thank you to a number of the faculty and graduate students I've had a chance to meet. The month and a half that I've been here, and looking forward to meeting others and many of you here as well that I have not had a chance to meet. So in some ways, this talk is kind of organized around some questions that I'm beginning to ask. And based on conversations that I've had with some of you here, and some of the verticals that Munzer just referred to, these are also questions that you're asking. As we began to sort of think about the many different ways in which we could potentially apply AI and machine learning, for example, to have impact in the sort of social justice space. And so, so a lot of what I'll do today is sort of draw from some of the projects here that I've learned about just since I've been here. That may be a little risky, but I think the projects raise a lot of interesting questions about how do we actually begin to sort of think about the application of these systems in the pursuit of racial justice and racial equity. And so it very much aligned with kind of my own interests and some of the work that we're doing at the University of Texas at Austin, which I'll allude to here momentarily. So about 3 years ago, the president of the university and the office of, and the vice president's office for research launched a sort of campus-wide grand challenge called Good Systems. And this was the third of 3 grand challenges. Another one was in health, another one was in climate. And this was sort of based on kind of a survey of the campus, faculty, graduate students, but also some external kind of reviews and feedback as well. And I suspect that maybe even some of your colleagues here were consulted about the degree to which the university should invest pretty significantly in creating resources, spaces, and opportunity for faculty to come together primarily across different disciplines to sort of pursue these questions. So Good Systems in some respects is a reference to what we oftentimes refer to as responsible or ethical artificial intelligence. And the idea, right, was to start bringing, computer scientists, engineers, data scientists, historians, social scientists, bringing them together to sort of think about these issues and to understand how that kind of interdisciplinarity, that the kind of sort of cross-discipline, if you will, conversations could help us all think about these issues in ways that perhaps we might not think about them if we were only sort of engaging colleagues in our own respective disciplines and silos. And so this is something that the university has, again, created some, I think, important resources for us to do and opportunities for us to do. About a year and a half ago, I was approached by Good Systems to start thinking about some of the issues around racial justice, racial equity, and its intersection with how we might think about responsible and ethical artificial intelligence. And so after a series of conversations and with various stakeholders, both on campus and around Austin and beyond, we began to start trying to craft the vision for what this might look like. And some of that work has included engagement with, for example, external stakeholders like the World Economic Forum, where earlier this year we had a series of events with them over the course of the week, looking at various issues related to the rise and the spread of artificial intelligence, machine learning, sort of computational systems in the world. And in at least one conversation that I was involved in, looking at the ways in which local governments were beginning to now adopt these systems and kind of what's at stake, when local officials and local governments start adopting and applying these systems. We're all familiar, for example, with the adoption of these systems in policing, but they're being also used in other areas as well: public health, housing, electricity, you name it, right? And increasingly, these sort of computational systems are being used as ways to exercise greater efficiency, to manage, massive amounts of data, but more importantly, right, to sort of serve local citizens. And one of the questions that we ask in some of the work that we're doing is, to what degree are these systems being used and leveraged in ways that serve all relatively, equally? I have a colleague, Chandra Bhatt, who's in the School of Engineering, who does work on transportation and mobility. And Chandra is part of this larger program that we're putting together around racial justice, racial equity, and computational systems. But he brings to our project, right, a number of interesting questions about the ways in which the built environment, how that contributes to and impacts mobility issues, higher rates of, being victims of being hit by cars, or pedestrians being hit by cars, and the degree to which we see, populations of color more likely to be subjected to those kinds of injuries and fatalities. So suggesting, right, that how we think about our mobility environment, right, and the sort of social justice issues that are beginning to emerge around that is something that we're certainly thinking about as well. Some of my own recent interests have been, part of my work over the years is focused on young people, their relationship to media, their relationship to different kinds of technologies, and the ways in which they're implicated, right, in this sort of data-driven world, datafied world that we are all living in and sort of implicated in. But here, right, if maybe some of you have followed just some of the data being generated by the CDC and the US Census and others, sort of just tracking different kinds of health outcomes and health trends sort of since the COVID pandemic began. And here is just a look at just the alarming rates of sort of mental health and the sort of crisis, if you will, that was already happening but has only been accelerated as a result of the pandemic. And we've begun to start, talking with mental health professionals and stakeholders, trying to think about the ways in which computational systems, chatbots, for example, might be designed and leveraged to sort of provide access to care, access to resources and information that might otherwise be difficult, right, for marginalized populations. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to talk a bit about this today, but we may not have time. But if you're interested, more than happy to talk with you later on. As Munzer said, I'm here for the entire academic year. And if you have questions at the end of my presentation, happy to entertain some of those questions as well. But about around this time last year, we started having conversations, right, with the city of Austin, and specifically the city's equity office. A number of cities around the country are creating equity offices, which are sort of charged primarily with the responsibility of making sure that the different departments across the city are addressing equity issues in a strategic and significant kind of way. And our approach to them was really trying to help them think about how we might be able to design what we call an AI equity toolkit. And that is to say, designing a system, designing a toolkit that might facilitate the ways in which departments are beginning to adopt these systems and thinking about these systems through a racial justice or racial equity lens. So for example, the kinds of systems they're procuring, the kinds of processes through which they are procuring these systems, what questions are they asking, and to what extent are they paying attention to some of the issues that we'll talk about today, and that is, right, the degree to which bias oftentimes can creep into the ways in which these computational systems function. And I would say that there's obviously, right, just a growing sort of body of literature around the ways in which these different kinds of technologies and systems are sort of implicated in how we might think about racial bias and racial discrimination. Our work has certainly been inspired and informed by this and other kind of work, and I suspect that for many of you, this is likewise, the case as well. Headlines like this was about a year and a half or so ago. An African-American male in Detroit was wrongly accused by a facial recognition system, and sort of just bringing to the public view, right, a kind of understanding and recognition of the high stakes that are implicated in these systems and the ways in which these sort of bias technologies can have real-world impacts and real-world results. And so I want to, thinking about this talk, and I said, let me just sort of narrow it in, because there's so many different questions that are beginning to emerge for me, even before coming here, and certainly since being here and learning about some of the work that you're doing, engaging both, some of the verticals that you developed here, particularly the policing group. Heard a wonderful presentation a week ago from the housing group, and also had a chance to visit and spend some time with the group in health. What I want to suggest today or argue today is that computational systems, as they have been designed to address issues of fairness, to address issues of bias and discrimination, have primarily constructed notions of what we might call notions of racism that pivot around sort of individualized notions or concepts of racism, as opposed to systemic or structural racism. And what I want to suggest today, right, is that in some ways that's understandable, but I think the challenge moving forward is how do we design computational systems that can attend to and speak to the sort of structural realities of systemic racism. And that's, a very different bar, to be quite frank, and something that I'm really interested to learn more from you about how we might pursue, that kind of a project, because I think that's really important. And I think that's really kind of where the field ultimately will be moving, and where I think sort of work, opportunity, and innovation are certainly possible. I also want to suggest, right, that the issues that I'll raise today are absolutely not unique to the machine learning community, to the practitioners, those who are developing these systems. Social scientists, policymakers, activists have all, had to sort of, reckon with and sort of understand in a much broader sense the notion of racism and the many different ways in which it manifests itself in the sort of material world that we all experience. Again, right, the main question that I want to pose today, and I don't have a complete answer to this question, but I think it's one that I would love to entertain my time here this year with you in terms of building more conversations. Many of the verticals, many of the projects that you're developing, I think are sort of pivoting towards this question. And that is, how can computational systems attend to the structural dynamics of racism? And what does it mean, right, for how models are built, designed, tested, and how we might pursue, again, that type of project. What I want to suggest as well is that this is both, I think, a technical and a social challenge. I mean, I think we sort of understand, right, the technical considerations or the technical challenges, but I also want to suggest, right, that there are enormous sort of social challenges as well in terms of how we think about these computational systems strategically. And what I want to suggest here, right, is that even to the extent that these systems, as we currently understand them today, and as they're currently designed today, may be somewhat limited, potentially, right, in terms of their capacity to deal with structural dynamics of racism, that there are other ways in which we can leverage the insights, other ways in which we can leverage the sort of precision, knowledge, and information that these systems can generate to affect change in some really important kinds of ways. And I'm going to offer a couple of suggestions in terms of how we might do that. I want to, just from some of the students that I've had a chance to meet, and students that I work with back in Austin, these are issues that are becoming more and more prominent, right? Not that long ago, these were issues that were kind of marginal to the field, I think. In some ways, it was, tech industry, for example, thought about these issues, right, as an afterthought, if they thought about them at all. And now, right, the sort of increasing kind of public scrutiny and public awareness is compelling them to sort of think about these issues in advance of building products and releasing them into the world. Just earlier last month, October, a staff or a team put together by the White House's sort of technology office released a kind of bill of AI rights, and this is in some ways, I think, representative of the kind of swirling of voices that are beginning to call for change, beginning to call for greater accountability in terms of the creation and the application of these systems. We know that tech industry are increasingly being scrutinized, and the threat of regulation is right around the corner. In Europe, for example, right, where you could make a case, right, that they're far more advanced in terms of how they're thinking about the sort of regulatory apparatus that's necessary to address some of these issues, but how they're beginning to think about data rights, how they're beginning to think about data privacy, how they're beginning to sort of think about the social, ethical, and political implications of AI and machine learning systems, and beginning to develop, policies, beginning to develop laws, if you will, that address these issues in a substantive kind of way. And so my point is, I think, particularly for those who are kind of coming up in the field, that these are issues that you are likely going to have to be able to be conversant in, attend to, if not actually execute to some degree practice in the work that you do. As Munzer noted, I've spent a lot of my academic career sort of thinking about racism, and my training is primarily as a social scientist, a PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan. And it was there that I began to start sort of developing a better understanding of the literature, the scope of the literature in terms of the social science literature as it relates to racism. And there are many different ways in which we could construct how we might sort of establish a framework here. But over the decades, right, social scientists have sort of mapped out, if you will, different dimensions of racism, right? How racism gets expressed in the material world, in sort of the everyday world. For example, we might think about interpersonal racism. This is, expressions of racism that, the use of racial epithets, sort of person-to-person violations, hate crimes, and things of this nature. These are oftentimes the things, right, that make the headlines, the things that disturb us the most. But nevertheless, it's these forms of interpersonal racism, what we might call more individualized forms of racism, that are oftentimes, I think, sort of shaping and informing the ways in which computational systems are trying to address issues of discrimination and bias. Institutional racism, I was first made aware of institutional racism reading the work of Stokely Carmichael and Hamilton as a part of the ways in which they were trying to expand how we were thinking about racism systematically and institutionally beyond the kinds of interpersonal forms of racism that were more common prior to the 1960s, for example. So this has been a body of literature in terms of how institutions function as a resource, how they sort of allocate resources, both material resources but also immaterial resources, prestige and status, for example. And the various sort of institutional mechanisms, policies, practices, norms, and behaviors that sort of shape institutions and how they, in some ways, practice institutional racism. And then there's structural racism, right? And this is the idea that you have these sort of complex kinds of institutions or subsystems that are kind of working together in concert to create, a sort of vast sort of, state, if you will, in which, resources are being allocated. But I want to show you a couple of things here that kind of, I think, bring this sort of to help visualize this. So this is and I'm drawing this from a sociologist. We might think of, institutionalized racism. So each of these different subsystems, right, have their own sort of distinct attributes, their own distinct features in which discrimination, functions. If it's segregation in schools, education, labor markets, criminal justice system, so forth and so on. And this may be, a way of sort of thinking about and understanding, right, a specific domain, right, that has its own unique history, its own unique attributes in which forms of discrimination, systems of discrimination are happening in ways that are quite unique to that domain or institution. And then when we start talking about structural racism, right, it's really the sort of linkages across these different institutions, these different domains. And this is right where the complexity really begins to kind of come into view in terms of how do you begin to sort of think computationally, right, about this type of a construct. And so this idea, right, that, take residential segregation, despite, right, its own sort of specific attributes and features, thinking about the ways in which other forms of discrimination, are sort of a trigger or are connected to the ways in which residential segregation happens. So it's this idea, right, that these things are relational, that these things are systematic, and that they are sort of reproduced in ways that are quite striking and sort of difficult to understand. And it's only, I would argue, right, it's only really within the last year and a half or two that a broader sort of public conversation about systemic or structural racism has really began to sort of take shape. And we think that this is an important opportunity for the kind of work that you're doing here and the work that we also aspire to do at UT Austin. This is another way of sort of thinking about this that's sort of helped me in terms of my own thinking and how I understand sort of the challenges that computational systems face in terms of trying to deal adequately or substantively with the issue of structural racism. And just really sort of looking here, right, and according to Reskin, right, there's sort of three conditions, right, according to her, that are met in terms of thinking about race discrimination, right, as a system, right, as a kind of structural, kind of component. This idea, right, that race-linked disparities exist in every subsystem. There's different subsystems that I just showed you earlier. At least some of these disparities result directly from discrimination. And third, disparities in each subsystem are reciprocally linked to disparities in other subsystems. And I highlight this because I think this is really, right, where the challenge is. It's this reciprocity, right, this sort of interconnectedness between these different subsystems that creates, right, a really interesting sort of computational challenge in terms of how do you model for that? Can you model for that? And if so, how might one go about trying to do that? And again, I don't have the answer to that question. I'm hoping that you and your students have the answer to that question. But it's this idea, right, that in some ways, right, if in fact we think that these systems should be designed and deployed in ways that attend to structural racism, I think these are the kinds of issues that we have to begin to start addressing and models that we have to keep in mind, but sort of understanding, right, this broader kind of structural dynamic that's driving these issues in some really interesting kinds of ways. I'm going to skip through this, but this is a report. Some of you may be familiar with the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, across the way over at Harvard. But they did a kind of review of both academic reports and reports by industry, sort of trying to sort of map, if you will, the ways in which different entities were beginning to understand the sort of ethical issues around artificial intelligence. And what they, after sort of surveying, right, different bodies of literature, different kinds of report, they identified these 8 themes. Many of them many of you here are likely familiar with. But the one theme, right, that appeared in their whole sort of sample of different things that they were looking, right, the database that they created, different articles, different reports, again from industry and academia, primarily, fairness and non-discrimination appeared in 100% of the data set that they created to help facilitate this study. And here were some of the themes under this particular, some of the principles under this particular theme: non-discrimination and prevention of bias, fairness and equity, that sort of echoed through this work that they were doing. And so the point being here, right, is that in terms of the ways in which both, I think, those of us in academia, but also those in industry and nonprofit and in the public sector, are beginning, right, to become much more attentive to the need to understand the ways in which these systems, if we're not careful, right, can sort of replicate at scale how we think about, right, discriminating systems. And this is why I think for many of us, this has become an area of interest, an area of research, and hopefully an area of intervention as well. And there are any number of ways in which I think, for example, the industry and those who do research in this space are beginning to sort of think about how we might understand bias and how we might understand the sort of ethical issues associated with these issues. And so, for example, here in this study, a group of researchers primarily from Google, thinking about the ways in which you can sort of build diversity and inclusion metrics into your subset selections. Sort of, again, we oftentimes hear that one of the primary dilemmas or one of the primary challenges in how these systems end up replicating bias, right, has to do with the lack of quality in the data set that's oftentimes driving these systems. If you sort of followed the literature and followed the conversations over the last few years or so in the machine learning community, there are many different definitions of fairness. Some of them oftentimes sort of contradictory. The idea, right, that if you adopt and try to apply one definition of fairness, then it then excludes, right, some of these other definitions. And so this has become, right, a sort of interesting conversation, an interesting sort of challenge. This tends to pivot around, in some cases, right, what we might call parity metrics. In some cases, right, these definitions try to render race neutral, the idea, right, that you take any features, any attributes that might explicitly reference race or allude to race, sort of eliminate those from the data set. The idea being that if you erase race, then it sort of makes it more possible for you to be non-racist, right, or anti-racist. And of course, what critics have suggested, right, that there may be other sort of proxy features or other kinds of proxy attributes that may not be explicitly racial, but nevertheless, right, stand in for race. And therefore, this idea, right, that even these systems that don't explicitly acknowledge race could still, practice racial bias in some way, shape, form, or fashion. Different trade-offs, right? The idea of can you have accuracy, predictive accuracy? Can you have transparency, for example? And the idea that, potentially, right, you can't have it all in the ways in which, these systems are then, treated as a result. In some cases, you have definitions of fairness or systems that execute what I would call a kind of algorithmic affirmative action, and that is to say where they try to compensate for racial disparity, where they try to compensate for the sort of legacy of bias and discrimination. There are many in the community, right, who sort of push back against that and perceive that, right, as just another form of unequal treatment or another form of bias, and therefore find this less a viable solution. But the point being, right, is that the notion of fairness, the construction of fairness, the definitions of fairness, within the ML community are quite diverse and sort of have raised a number of interesting, sort of perplexing questions over the years. And and I'm just beginning to become more familiar with this literature, but I think it raises a really interesting question, right, that for us to sort of think about, and that is, can you be quote unquote fair and still practice the pursuit of racial justice or racial equity? And I think it's a really interesting question, and something, right, for all of us to think about in some regards. In some ways, right, it seems kind of contradictory, but I think as you begin to understand the ways in which these notions of fairness are being played out, are being designed, being built into these computational systems, we can understand, right, how those two aims, fairness and racial equity or racial justice, under this construct, right, might in some ways be incompatible. There's also a growing body of literature looking at the ways in which some of the practitioners in this field, how they are sort of explaining and describing what they need in order to be more attentive to these issues of bias and discrimination within these systems. And this, of course, right, at various points of the development life cycle, from problem formulation, data collection and processing, modeling, to deployment and monitoring. And these are just, some of the things that some researchers have identified as some of the resources and toolkits, that practitioners note that they need in order to be more effective in addressing these issues in a much more adequate kind of way. My understanding, right, from reading some of this literature is that, they see data curation as a primary problem. And how do you build representative data sets, when you start thinking about subpopulations and trying to compensate for some of the biases that we've noticed historically, there are no guidelines, right? There's no blueprint, right, for how they might do that. And many are asking for checklists, they're asking for toolkits, they're asking for automated systems that allow them to do that in a way that is sort of aligned with workflow and other kinds of challenges and expectations that they face in the business of producing and building these kinds of computational systems. But generally speaking, right, is again, I think that the point that I keep coming to here is that when you read this literature, they're still sort of understanding the work of anti-bias, the work of anti-discrimination, primarily through the lens of constructing and defining racism as an individualized problem as opposed to a structural problem. And again, this is a kind of a common theme that sort of emerges throughout the literature. And so, most of the interventions, most of the modeling, most of the kind of computational system thinking, still tends to operate along this region of this continuum. And that is, right, this notion of treating likes alike, I think in some ways is a reflection of this gravitation towards constructing these issues along interpersonal and individualized terms as opposed to institutional and structural terms. Let me sort of shift to some of the work that I've learned about since I've been here for a month and a half. And again, as Munson mentioned, there's a sort of, I think, a campus-wide interest and a campus-wide effort and initiative to really begin to start thinking about the future of computing and thinking about the ways in which this future might be more engaged with issues around structural racism. And so I've had a chance to sort of learn a bit from what's happening with the policing vertical, the health vertical, and the housing vertical. And while they're all, right, their own sort of distinct or separate domains, Again, as we begin to sort of think about this through a structural lens, you can begin to sort of see where there may be some connections and some relationships in terms of how each of these projects might at least be responsive to each other. I think a kind of a core question for me that runs through these projects is, can computational models address structural racism? If so, how? How would we go about doing that? Again, right, understanding this is both a technical challenge, right, data curation, modeling, robust auditing, and things of that nature. But also, what I would argue, right, is a social challenge, and that is to say, just really sort of thinking about how these computational systems and the sort of insights that they generate, how they might translate into different kinds of interventions, policy interventions, interventions in terms of training, interventions in terms of education. I think there are all kinds of possibilities, right, that exist in terms of how we might understand what I would call, right, as opposed to when we think of downstream effects, we tend to think of, biases, discrimination, the ways in which these systems, as they sort of roll out and get, implicated in society, the sort of negative aspects or attributes that we tend to associate with them. But here I want to suggest, right, what are the downstream possibilities, right? In other words, how might we understand the ways in which these systems might open up opportunities to sort of think critically and to intervene in the ways in which systemic or structural racism sort of reproduces itself. So again, this is all relatively new to me in terms of just being introduced to some of the work that you're doing here. But this is from a paper that the policing group had a chance. The policing group here at IDSS a couple of weeks ago had a chance to hear from Burke and some of his colleagues, I think at UPenn and also Carnegie Mellon, if I'm not mistaken. And basically, this was a paper about fair risk assessment models. Right? And and while I didn't agree with all of the paper, it raises, I think, some really compelling questions for many of us to think about in terms of this work. And so, for example, part of what he was grappling with, right, is how should models, in this particular context, treat black and white offenders, right? Should you treat white offenders like you treat black offenders? Should you treat black offenders like you treat white offenders? Or should you do something else entirely different? In terms of, how do you create a computational system that makes an assessment about potential dangerousness, right? If you release someone, what's the likelihood that they would recommit, a dangerous crime? And he sort of described the different kinds of processes that he and his team went through, the kind of modeling exercises that they went through. But essentially what they ended up doing was trying to create a computational system that treated black offenders like white offenders. And this is at least my understanding. And obviously, right, that raises a lot of interesting questions, right? To what extent, right, does that make sense? To what extent are there sort of external factors or circumstances that might render, such a computational perspective, deeply problematic, right? I think in some cases. But he went on, right, and the paper goes on to make some really interesting observations about what is possible, right, with a computational system in terms of addressing, right, the complexities of structural racism. And this idea of what he referred to as sort of internal fairness, sort of introducing this notion of internal fairness versus external fairness. And again, right, this was a couple of weeks ago and still sort of reading the paper and trying to understand, how he's sort of making this argument and positioning this argument within a broader body of literature. But it's this idea, right, that these kinds of algorithms or these kinds of computational systems are somewhat limited, right, in terms of what they can actually address or attend to. And the idea, right, that there are many external, issues related to fairness, right? So once you release a black and white offender, right, some external factors might be poverty, some external factors might be police treatment, some external factors may be these other kinds of structural elements, that we referred to earlier, that are in all likelihood, right, going to impact, right, the quality of that experience, the likelihood of a potential reoffense or some engagement with the criminal justice system. And this argument, right, is that you can't expect a computational model or system to account for that, right? And that is just incredibly difficult and in some ways unreasonable to think that it might be able to do that. And so, for me, it really introduces, I think, a really provocative question, and that is, what can we reasonably expect from these computational systems when it comes to really being attentive to and wanting to address and intervene in the replication of structural or systemic racism? And so this is something that I think for many of us, right, who are sort of interested in these issues, I mean, I think this is a core sort of driving question that we'll have to grapple with in the work that we do. We also heard about housing, the presentation that you made, which I found, really striking and really interesting. And it too, right, raises a lot of interesting, questions about, to what extent computational systems can identify some of the challenges and some of the barriers, some of the disparities that you and your team have identified in terms of some of the research that you're doing. You noted, for example, right, the importance of home ownership in this country, for example, in terms of wealth accumulation. If you read some of the work in sociology, and here I'm thinking specifically about the work of Oliver and Shapiro, they argue, right, that the issue of home ownership is even more critical for African Americans, for example, because compared to their white counterparts, home ownership is primarily the exclusive pathway to wealth generation for them, compared to whites, right, who may have other assets, other resources, investments, stocks, inheritance, right, other kinds of financial resources that might provide a pathway to wealth generation. But for African Americans, almost exclusively, right, it's through the ability to own a home that provides access to wealth accumulation. And so when you begin to sort of think about, right, the sort of systemic and sort of structural realities that sort of limit or diminish their prospects for this type of home ownership, right, it has sort of massive implications. If you think about that sort of messy kind of structural racism, graph that I showed earlier, you can begin to see how it has a triggering effect right across this broader kind of societal system. And when you were presenting, and I was thinking about your work, right, and at least part of what I understood from your work, and I could be wrong, is that there are certain outcomes related to disparities in lending practices that we can explain. And then there are certain percentages of that outcome that we can't explain. And to what extent, right, could you design a computational system to be able to adequately sort of fill in those gaps and sort of address some of those issues? And I think it's a really interesting dilemma, that you and your team are likely to face. But as I was listening to you, I was thinking, so, what is the structural problem? What are the structural barriers that sort of speak to, for example, the debt to income ratio that you were alluding to, that you were referencing? And this suggests, right, that I think to the point that you were making, right, that even if you are able to build a computational system that could deal adequately, right, with some of these disparities here, something like this, right, is something that a computational system is likely limited, right, in terms of being able to affect, and limited in terms of being able to address. And so what does that mean in terms of how we begin to think about the role and possibilities of these systems in a broader kind of structural system where, obviously debt to income ratio is related to education, it's related to the employment market, it's related to, health, it's related to a whole range of other kinds of subsystems that we saw earlier that make up this complex maze of sort of structural discrimination, this system of structural discrimination that renders, addressing these issues from a computational perspective more challenging and certainly much more difficult. And what one of the ways in which I'm thinking about this, right, are what are the downstream possibilities of computational systems to help sort of mitigate, right, some of the institutional and structural challenges that your work is likely to sort of continue identifying and addressing. And that is to say, I think it just raises some really interesting possibilities in terms of what are some other ways in which these systems might inform policy, might inform other kinds of interventionist strategies that might help us to better address, some of these disparities here. This was an interesting, I don't know if you saw this, but an interesting piece in the New York Times, I think earlier this year, about the ways in which a new generation of fintech companies are beginning to try to design computational systems that address some of these challenges that we've seen historically in more conventional lending systems, trying to design algorithms that create different kinds of databases, create different kinds of metrics for how we measure and understand and evaluate someone's trustworthiness and whether or not they would be able to repay a loan of any significance. And even as they're attempting to sort of create something that's very different from what we have seen conventionally, some of the issues that still sort of creep into these systems that make them not necessarily the perfect solution, but certainly solutions that are going to likely continue to evolve over the next several years or so. And then finally, let me just say a little something about a project that we heard about, I think last week, and I've had a chance to Fatini has been gracious enough to invite me to some of the meetings that this team is having. This is a group that essentially is sort of doing a language analysis of the medical notes that nurses take based on their patients. And at least my understanding of the project, and I could be wrong, but my understanding of the project is what they're trying to do is essentially build a model that if you were to take out any sort of, in the notes that nurses are taking, any explicit reference, right, feature or attribute that might identify a person's race, if you could sort of eliminate those elements from the notes, could a model still detect or determine, right, the race of that patient based on other kinds of words, based on other kinds of sentiments that are being expressed in those notes? I think it's a really interesting and sort of fascinating project, and it's for me, as I'm learning more and more about that project and listening to that presentation and sitting in on some of the meetings, there again are a number of questions that I think strike at the heart of the work that we're trying to do through the work that you're trying to do through these different kinds of verticals, and the work that I think we're trying to do at UT Austin as well. So for example, what do these notes suggest about the kinds of perceptions that healthcare workers have about their Black and white patients? And to what extent, right, is this a reflection of, or does this give us any indication in terms of the quality of care that they're providing their patients? And we know, for example, right, that through the literature that race discrimination in care is quite prominent in terms of, in some cases, lack of access to care. There are any number of sort of studies that have documented and noted the sort of diagnosis and treatment or quality of care that's delivered based on some of these kinds of implicit biases that oftentimes filter into the sort of interactions between healthcare workers and the patients that they serve. And I guess the question that I have here, right, is my sense is that the model isn't necessarily trying to address some of the more systemic or structural aspects of racism in terms of the delivery of healthcare and medicine. But I think it has the potential to sort of generate additional insight in terms of how we understand the ways in which these practices and behaviors sort of develop and evolve right through the delivery of healthcare, if you will. And so, for instance, one of the questions that I have is how can we deploy the insights from this model, right? So if this model is able to predict, right, the race of a patient, based on language that's being used, certain words that are being used, how might we use, that information, that insight, to have some type of impact in terms of the sort of institutional and sort of structural attributes that sort of shape and inform our healthcare system and the ways in which services are delivered. And here are just, I think, a couple of examples, and this is what I mean in some ways by, when I say social challenge or downstream possibilities, the ways in which we can sort of translate the insights, translate the knowledge that these systems generate into interventions that could potentially have some impact in terms of how we think about systemic or structural racism, for example. So there is a growing call within the medicine and public health community, for example, to be much more deliberate and much more intentional about incorporating structural racism into the curriculum and into the ways in which medical students, for example, are taught and trained. And also, right, thinking about the ways in which healthcare workforce are being trained, right, particularly as it relates to implicit bias and other forms of discriminating behavior. The point being, right, is that these computational systems can in some ways give us really rich and incredible insight that could inform other kinds of interventions, if you will, that might have downstream impact on the ways in which these systems function, the ways in which these institutions operate, that could then begin to, I think, address some of the sort of structural realities and structural challenges that we find in this work. And just real finally, just sort of thinking about the future of computational systems, what I'm learning as I think about the work that you're doing here, the work that we're trying to do in Austin, the sort of emerging sort of literature around this, is that transparency and specificity are, I think, increasingly important. And what I mean by transparency in this sense, right, is just sort of acknowledging what a model can and can't do, right, in terms of addressing some of these more structural dynamics associated with racism. Reframing, the problem formulation. Again, to the extent that questions around fairness, the ways in which computational systems have treated and sort of defined fairness tend to focus on disparate outcomes, individuals, for example, as opposed to addressing disparate processes and practices. And how that shift, right, the focus on structures to focus on systems, right, and trying to think about that through a computational lens might be, I think, an interesting challenge or interesting opportunity for us. And then finally, right, again, just thinking about these downstream possibilities and how we can leverage these models with other kinds of interventionist strategies, and so that we don't necessarily, expect computational systems to perform this work by themselves, right? As if they are a source of magic that can sort of, miraculously overturn, right, histories and legacies of structural racism, but how they may be combined with other kinds of interventions, combined with other kinds of strategies as a way of sort of finding the pain points in this sort of broader sort of complex, this maze of structural racism that we might be able to address. And so these are just, some thoughts. Again, some provocations as I began to sort of think about these issues, learn more about the work that you're doing, which I think is really important and in some ways, right, helps to provide some really important frameworks for how we might think about the future of computational systems. So I'll stop there and open it up for questions or just conversation.
It's a wonderful talk, and also just so thrilled that you accepted the invitation to stay here. Oh, sure. So, well, first I was just complimenting the talk for being wonderful, and then also just expressing my gratitude and pleasure that you accepted the invitation to be here for in an entire year, and so all that were involved, like Munzer, Fatini, as well, for helping to make it happen. And so, just one observation and a kind of question too. The observation is just where you mention, first, there's a lot of these issues, of course, persist in what's called the metaverse often now. That's strewn throughout digital media. That includes virtual worlds, gaming systems, but also I think a lot of connections between the kind of medical records and online accounts and so forth. Those types of virtual identities have a very close connection to the metaverse. And so I feel like a lot of the research approaches that have been applied to social media and these other forms of categorization may also apply to analysis of some of these kind of, you could say, physical world data sets. But the question relates to where you talk about fairness earlier in the talk and mention work like John Kleinbird's work, other work, where it describes what are the different definitions of fairness and how are they mathematically defined and so forth. In some of the work we did quite some time back, we also began to look at what was called intentional vocabulary in AI papers. Not intentional in the sense that the system is trying to do something, intentional in the philosophical sense. That is, this is about the world, engage with the world, and so forth. And what that means is using terms such as fairness, or the system is treating people in some kind of way, or learning systems, these sort of things, attribute human-like intentions to the systems in some way. And what we found was that those terms would appear in crucial sections of the paper for rhetorical effect, and these algorithms weren't always described in purely mathematical terms, and where they were was also very telling in certain aspects of the papers. And so I wonder, besides just looking at the definitions of fairness, also the structuring and the rhetoric and the use of these words, say compared to where you mentioned race neutral or Eduardo Bonilla Silva's ideas like colorblind racism, and these sort of things might make quite a difference in the construal of these algorithms. I think it's very interesting when you strip away the terms like fairness and just describe functionally what the algorithm does, the reading of the paper can be quite different. And I just wonder what your reaction to this kind of idea about, besides definition, but the kind of rhetorical structuring of intentional language as well as algorithmic descriptions. What's your reaction to this kind of idea?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting question. And do you mean sort of the rhetorical strategies of those who are sort of writing the paper, sort of creating these systems, and sort of defining these terms that we tend to use or at least see in the literature?
Right, and it may be. I don't want to take more time, but since you asked me, it may be implicit. It's not. I'm not saying that it's something that these authors are trying to embed bias in the papers, but it's just that there are a lot of places in papers where, for rhetorical effect or structuring or introductory reasons, why we use terms that seem quite human-like, and other parts of the papers where we use statistical terms and other types of algorithmic terms. But if you were to replace fairness with something like colorblind racism in the same paper and use Eduardo Bonilla Silva's definition, then it will have quite a different reading, even though they're both talking about eliminating the use of race as part of the metric.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's an interesting question. In part, right? I think I wonder to what extent it's at least partly related to this sort of inclination to sort of, to construct these terms and our understanding of racism in these more sort of individualized or kind of interpersonal ways, right? In ways that are more accessible to people, in ways that people might understand the urgency, right? But nevertheless, don't attend to the more subtle, the more hidden, sort of, structural and sort of institutional ways in which, these systems oftentimes, are replicated. And so, again, which is why I wanted to just at least reference some of that sort of long historical literature in the social sciences in terms of how racism has been studied, the many different dimensions of racism, and how, to your point, right, language, terms that we use can oftentimes either inform or misinform, how we understand these issues, what's at stake, their implications, and how they might be, in some ways, incorporated into these computational models as a way of trying to address some of these very issues.
Hi, thank you so much. So I had a thought listening to your talk. So a lot of definitions of fairness, as you very well pointed out, like they really don't actually get rid of discrimination, right? What they're actually doing is they're just removing terms that make that discrimination obvious. So if you can't say race anymore, you can't say ethnicity anymore, that doesn't actually change the fact that it's still happening, right? It makes me think of like Michelle Alexander's work and how, she argues that basically this whole system has just been changing and more deftly and more subtly having racism keep happening. And so when I think back to your early part of your talk where you're talking about the structural, the institutional, and the interpersonal, I think that the interpersonal has a place in this more than what you talked about. And I want to get your thoughts on this. Like, a lot of times what happens when we talk about algorithmic fairness or algorithmic like neutrality is we're basically removing the mentions of race. So you can't say someone is black or Asian or whatever it is, but it doesn't change the fact that like if there is a person who has a particular hair texture or a particular physical or cultural marker of race, that can still be encoded into that system. And that is the interpersonal level, right? So how do you think that integrates into this?
Because I would agree with you. I didn't mean to suggest if I did that the racism tend to sort of predominate in terms of public discourse, public conversation. When you look at how these computational systems are oftentimes constructed or developed, it's largely right through that framework, and that isn't in and of itself problematic. But if in fact your goal or your kind of interest is addressing these more structural kinds of considerations or structural barriers, then I think it requires a different kind of formulation that we haven't seen, at least I haven't seen to date yet. But that interpersonal, institutional, and structural, those are all sort of mutually reinforcing, right? And in some respects, right, they all sort of are related to each other. And so I didn't want to suggest or to minimize, right, that those formulations or those expressions of racism are insignificant. Because to your point, right, they certainly can and oftentimes do creep into the ways in which these systems are formulated.
Thank you for a great talk. My name is Ken Oy. I'm in political science and IDSS. Your talk made a basic distinction that we've been talking about between individual fairness and structural racism. And the challenge for AI is the low threshold. Certainly we want individual fairness. High threshold correction for pervasive structural racism. Questions that I have really come down to the following. If we're talking about that lowest threshold, you gave us good examples. Okay, I love the loan officers versus platforms, with the platforms being fairer. Or potentially, facial recognition software being fairer than old-fashioned police lineups. Or for me, going through customs and immigration before 9/11 was an ordeal. After 9/11, when they were using AI, I was in much better shape because MIT professor looks better than mysterious Asian guy with a mustache. Okay, so the point there is, could you tell us more about ways that the low threshold might be hit more effectively by at least accomplishing, let's call it, individual fairness? The harder question is the following. We're sitting around now talking about AI, but many of the issues that you've been discussing have been around for a long time. If we're talking about bona fide occupational qualifications and testing, or if we're talking about any other criteria for hiring, we keep running into ways in which instruments being used have the effect of reinforcing and interacting with structural racism. And so the second question really is, so what's new? I asked that question with trepidation at MIT. But seriously, what's new? Validation has been around for a long time. Calls for having varieties and forms of offsets and affirmative action have been around for a long time. So what's new about, let's call it, the AI angle on these topics? Thanks very much.
That's a great question. Thank you. I take affirmative action, right? Because it's I had a slide in there and then I took it out, which I think sort of addresses some of what you were asking. And I did say earlier, right, that these questions, they aren't unique, right, to the data science, machine learning, AI community. That these are issues, right, that policymakers, social scientists, activists have been addressing and confronting for some time. And so you're exactly right, in terms of just the legacy and the sort of historical nature, of these challenges. And again, what I wanted to say about affirmative action, right, particularly when I was thinking about, this notion of algorithmic affirmative action, is thinking about more conventional expressions or formulations of affirmative action. Let's take college admissions, for example, right, and the degree to which, even at their height, those sort of interventions never really dealt with the kinds of structural considerations that lead to these disparities in terms of race and ethnicity regarding college admissions. And so the point being there that I wanted to make is, again, that these aren't questions that are unique. These aren't questions that are new. These aren't questions that are specific to AI and the conversation that we're having here. But then in some ways, right, they have a much longer trajectory, a much longer history. And so in that sense, I would agree with you that there is historical precedent. There are other sort of formulations, other sort of episodes where these issues play out in similar kinds of ways. But of course, what makes what's happening, with these computational systems, I think so striking, right? Again, it's just the scale and the pace at which these decisions can be made, the ways in which impact can be rendered, which I think for many of us, right, raises a significant degree of alarm. But generally speaking, right, these interventions like affirmative action have still primarily been predicated on these more individualized notions of fairness. And to your point, right, again, it's not that those notions or treatments of fairness are insignificant or that we should ignore them, but only, right, that if we ignore them to the exclusion of these broader kinds of structural considerations, we in some ways deal with the symptom and not really the problem, I think.
Yeah. Said that okay.
I think it's for the video.
Said that we have, in a way, different measures for fairness, and there are measures that you can't fully satisfy them together. Let's say 2 metrics that you. So, what can we do? Like, we need to choose. Like, we need to, in a sense, to like create some sort of order. Like, how can we do it?
Yeah, if I understand your question, I mean that's part of what I was suggesting toward the end is just being more, because you're right. I mean, we're constantly making choices in this space about what to include, what not to include, what definitions, what frameworks, data sets, and you name it. And I think what I'm beginning to understand, right, from people who are trying to address these issues in a variety of different sort of spaces, is again, I think, to be very clear, to be very transparent about the choices that one is making, the implications of those choices, and what that means, right, for what we might think a computational system is able to do, or how it might perform, right, in the real world. And so it's not that those choices are necessarily inherently bad, or that making choices is inherently bad. But I think in this case, right, just being much more transparent about the choices that are being made and how that might impact, sort of have downstream impact and implications, is something that we can be much more, I think, transparent about.
Maybe I can make a comment about this. Yeah, so, and we can discuss it, we have plenty of time, but I think also this talks a little bit about the framing of the problem. I mean, there's a lot of focus on a mathematical formulation that can capture the notion of fairness, but I think what we're seeing is that, or justice, but I mean, I think we're seeing that there's no mathematical formulation that can capture this notion. And I think maybe a lot of this research has been on the defensive end of saying, what is the algorithmic bias, But what about we turn it around and say, well, can AI actually help in this problem? I mean, if there are situations where the systemic problem, can the AI solution detect them by employing the data in a particular way? So now we're at a different bar here. We're not trying to define justice, but rather we're trying to define, the counterfactual of that.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that in terms of, just the constraints, right, that we have to understand as it relates to these systems and what they're potentially capable of doing. And I think that formulation makes a lot of sense in terms of just sort of reframing, how we position these computational systems in the world, and then what is reasonably, can be reasonably expected in terms of how they might attend to or address some of these issues as it relates to sort of structural or systemic kinds of inequalities.
Well, I'm going to actually stop this conversation. We do have, we have a reception out there at the 3rd floor, so there's plenty of time to continue this discussion in case some people wanted to leave. So thanks again, Craig, for a wonderful presentation, and we'll take it at the back. So,